This evening we have a subject that is, to say the least, rather inflammable. And the last thing we want to do is to add any fuel to the flames. There has been a great deal of work in the last 25 years trying to solve these basic human problems. And this evening, I want to speak very largely out of personal contact with problems of this nature over a period of almost 40 years. Perhaps I've had some advantages in not being bound too closely to a school of thought which required continuous defense. And also, because in my own peculiar capacity, I have managed to penetrate a little more deeply into the philosophical backgrounds of persons' lives. We are all today tremendously interested in bringing the world together, whether it be political, religious, scientific unity, or whether it goes further into more abstract fields dealing with anthropology or culture. Yet we are faced today with the greatest field of division that exists in what we call the male-female concept, by which humanity is divided against itself. And the problem of bridging this basic interval will probably contribute a great deal to the solution of nearly all other problems. As one very brilliant thinker observed many years ago, the world's unpleasant people are the world's unhappy people. Nearly always unreasonable or inordinate ambition, the despotic urge in human character, arises from personal dissatisfactions, from the failure of the individual's personal life to provide security, integration, and proper outlook towards living situations in general. Professor Freud has given us a concept of society based upon the inevitability of sex differentiation. And he has taken the position that most of our human problems, intellectual, moral, emotional, and physical, stem from this ancient conflict of male and female principles operating psychologically and biologically. Now, it would seem unwise to differ from so learned a man, yet those who have had the courage to differ are increasing in strength and importance every day. And there is now a general feeling among progressive thinkers in psychology and psychiatry that in these conclusions Dr. Freud was a bit of a dodo, and that a great many of his pet theories represented a kind of experience within a clinical situation in which there was much evidence to support Dr. Freud. Yet this evidence was not sufficiently examined on a philosophical level. Within his own world, within his own sphere of activity, he did a prodigious work, laying foundations that in one way or another will endure, but which will be subject to considerable reorganization and reconstruction as time goes on. It seems to me that Dr. Freud allowed a secondary cause to occupy a primary place. The real problem behind the human being is not his sex life. The problem is himself. as a total person. And the Freudian hypothesis has become one of the most beautiful escape mechanisms from personal responsibility that we have ever had presented to us with scientific support. As far as his theories go, they can be in many ways sustained, but his theories do not go far enough. I have worked with thousands of persons who are in emotional, personal dilemmas. And I think we must first approach our situation in an effort to clarify what might be termed relationship. Relationship is the ability of the individual to exist within a society. This society, whatever it may be, presents him continuously with pressures, also with a quantity of circumstances which may become highly irritating, difficult, even disastrous. That the individual shall attain a social maturity is essential to his well-being. Most persons having domestic difficulties have evidence within their natures of lack of personal, social maturity. They have not quite grown up. They have not a philosophy of life or a way of life strong enough to exercise directive. And they also lack the inclination to assume personal responsibility for the difficulties in which they find themselves. This does not mean that we will not continually be impelled to blame someone else. But the convenient situation of regarding the male-female relationship as the perfect evasion for the need for individual maturity should be examined and be given a lot more thought than most persons have bestowed upon it. Actually, relationship is the individual's capacity to get along in a variety of situations. Most persons who are having more or less difficult emotional relationships have also other symptoms. They are not doing very well on any level of relationships. They are not getting along well with their friends. They are not getting along much better with their children than they are with the marriage partner. They are not getting along too well with society as a collective. They move into various situations, religious, political, social, and in all these situations, their basic tensions continue to be prominent. So I think our first matter for consideration might be the almost empiric statement that we have no evidence in experience or from nature that God or nature intended to create a twofold humanity for the purpose of locking this twofold humanity in perpetual strife. That does not seem to have been the original idea. If it was not the original idea, then something went wrong. It was not the original notion of humanity that what we call civilization should end in an age of atomic bombs. It was not absolutely essential to the universal plan of things that man's instinct to religion should lead to the Inquisition or break his spiritual life into 500 or more sects that cannot get along together. Wherever we find natural situations, natural conditions, we also find that natural providence intended them to succeed, to produce good for all concerned. Where a situation does not produce good, we must come to the conclusion that it has been misinterpreted, or that situations artificial and inconsistent with good have been allowed to become dominant. We know this in a great many problems of human society. We know that almost every part of our way of life has come to be abused. And abuse is the ultimate and final proof of ignorance. To do things badly is to prove conclusively that our knowledge of doing them well has not touched into our inner life sufficiently to give us the courage to do things well. And until knowledge or education accomplishes this internal stimulation of resolution, we haven't accomplished very much in the advancement of any major subject in art, science, or human relationships. Assuming, therefore, what I think we must assume, namely that the divine plan was right, our trouble is that humanity has not correctly interpreted that plan and has permitted a series of situations to arise which were not intended and which cannot succeed by their mere continuance. A real and definite effort must be made to put the situation back into proper perspective and into proper relationship. Essentially, as far as nature is concerned, it has certain ends which must be achieved. The biological end, as far as the human species is concerned, is reproduction, the continuance of the life form. And nature has placed within this instinct a tremendous pressure in order that the continuity of life forms might be assured. Therefore, for man, one of his natural responsibilities, and nature will continuously press this responsibility, is that his species shall survive, and that the tremendous and lengthy procedure by which man has been elevated to his present state of biological and psychological culture shall not be destroyed by the failure of the instinct to reproduction. This, we know, is part of the human plan. We also observe that as the race or species advances in nature, that reproduction moves from a primary end to a more or less secondary end. We know, for example, that in many forms of primitive life, particularly in the lower kingdoms, life more or less terminates with the fulfillment of the reproductive procedure. The creature achieves the perpetuation of its species and perishes. This is not true, however, in the case of the human being. In the case of humanity, a very rich and full life extends beyond the period of reproduction, giving the individual a hint that his life is to be creative on more than one level. He is not merely creative physically. He is creative emotionally, creative intellectually, and spiritually. On all these levels, he is using a highly refined form of the creative instinct. He is using it to beautify his world, to write great books, to create great music, to build wonderful structures, and to advance abstract philosophies and sciences. Thus, man has a larger life that might generally be considered biological. That this entire life should suspend entirely from the biological factor is not entirely reasonable. And many of our more progressive psychologists, such as Adler to a degree, and Carl Jung to a greater degree, have pointed out that there are other and more important drives, or shall we say equally important drives, by which the individual is pressed forward to the fulfillment of his own life pattern. That there should be and must be a balanced group of drive forces cannot be denied. We're catching up to the fact of this very rapidly. Now, this does not mean that the individual is emancipated from the peculiar complications that arise from his biological instincts, but it does mean that these instincts are not the total person, nor do they represent the total motivation for human conduct. The derangement of these instincts, or the failure of their reasonable expression, can certainly result in a neurotic complication. But that these derangements should necessarily be fatal to the total life, or that these derangements should be so inevitable that reasonable and thoughtful persons cannot control and direct them, would seem to be inconsistent with the general achievement of mankind as a total structure. Therefore, we may point out that in various periods of life in which the entire social history of man is recapitulated, that we observe that during the early period of life, that most suitable for the propagation of the species, the drive in this direction is the most powerful. As the life moves into more advanced states, mentally and emotionally, this drive subsides under normal conditions. If it does not subside to a reasonable degree, then the individual is simply perpetuating his own adolescence by some circumstance or condition. This does not imply by any means that the sexual factor ceases after a period of generative activity. It simply means that it is in many respects modified, changed, and redirected, so that it does not have to remain throughout life the only dynamic drive in the character of the individual. It is not necessary for his life, from childhood to the grave, to be completely dominated by sex instinct, as he commonly understands this term. For it to be so completely dominated is not only to impoverish him, but to go contrary to the obvious pattern of his life at this stage of his evolutionary development. Therefore, we have to give all these matters their proper consideration, and to regard them more or less in a mature way. What are the principal circumstances that have created our difficulty? An individual is born ignorant, but he is not born misinformed. He must attain to this state by a direct effort of his own. He may not know, but being ignorant, he is capable of being instructed. Not knowing and being ignorant, he is also capable of being misinstructed or misinformed on subjects of the greatest importance to himself. Therefore, perhaps it is important at this time for us to make a little digression into history, particularly as it applies to our sociological interests, in order to understand our problem. I think we can say that, for the most part, primitive mankind, the aboriginal part of society, while in a curious way divided on its own levels, much as we have become divided on a higher cultural platform, did not suffer from nearly the complications that we have in these fields. Dr. Margaret Mead, who has done a great deal of work of research among the primitive people of New Guinea, has some rather nice and informing thoughts to give us on this subject. She points out that among the, we might say, more naturally benign tribes in this area. Most of our social problems have been solved in a very simple manner, solved primarily by not complicating them, solved by simply accepting certain values with what almost might be regarded as the naivete of childhood. Among the values that these people early discovered and are still practicing in their own little isolated culture center is an almost complete democracy on the problem of male-female relationships. There is practically none of the overtones, there are none of the overtones which plague us. One of the simple discoveries that they made, and which we apparently have not yet been able to reformulate, was that the basis of cooperation on the male-female problem is a recognition of common responsibility in common purposes. In other words, one of our difficulties, perhaps, has arisen from the childbearing function of woman, which has become a unique circumstance. Well, obviously, the natives of New Guinea have not been able to do very much about the basic uniqueness of this circumstance, nor will anyone else. But they immediately set to work on a program that has only been introduced into our way of thinking in the last 20 years, and that is the importance of increasing the father's role in the early life of the child. This separation of the importance of these roles has helped to build barriers, basic barriers. So what happens in New Guinea? In New Guinea, the moment the child is born, the father becomes the second mother. And in almost every respect, other than that of childbearing and early nutrition, the father shares in everything. He spends an equal amount of time with the small child. He prepares its food. He works with it. It becomes as much an immediate responsibility of his own as it is that of the mother. And until the child reaches a certain age, the father, as well as the mother, is regarded as being directly involved in the birth process, as far as this can be accomplished. In New Guinea, it is accomplished by religious ceremony. Certain ceremonies are required of the father. He must accept the duties, for example, of the spiritual protection of the infant from the evil spirits and all of the mysterious hazards of primitive society. He becomes as much burdened as far as his time allotments are concerned as the mother, and has an immediate duty to protect the soul of the child, giving the father an invisible job, which, however, in the taboos of the clan, is just as important as the visible job. The child is never for a moment assumed to be capable of growing up without the mutual cooperation of both parents. This is important psychologically. It brings the family into closer psychological integration and does not permit the idea that the tasks of the family are divisible. Every task in the family has its polarizations, and both parents have to assume their proper roles. And should the father fail, it is very probable the child will also die, because it has not received the proper spiritual help from the father, has not received the exchange of magnetism, or its equivalent, which the father was presumed to bestow. Thus, a rather close situation has been established among these people. And from this situation, as it develops into later years, the child's own psychology becomes much better oriented. And it has been noted by nearly all anthropologists and ethnologists working with primitive peoples that your problem child is almost unknown, simply because the child has never been exposed to a problem concept in the relationships of its parents. Now, to a great many persons to whom the health and security of their children are important considerations, this in itself is almost enough of an inducement to urge the parent to make certain intellectual, moral, and emotional adjustments in his own living. Today, of course, much of this situation is lost. We realize that in the modern family, time allotments are very different from in New Guinea. We realize the problem of the support of a family becomes a very different type of cooperation, less intimate and, unfortunately, less psychologically secure. Going back also through the period in which what we might call this concept of the eternal war of the sexes has developed, we observe constantly in the psychological, sociological history of the race how this war has been artificially created and sustained, that it has resulted from wrong educational attitudes, that it has developed very largely, we regret to say, from very bad religious situations, which perhaps we do not realize. It has also been heavily supported by the gradual development of the patriarchal system in society, which has had its part to play. Now, the patriarchal system is a peculiar thing, and it is one of the common elements in the great conflict under discussion, psychologically satisfying in a moment of emergency, to say that this is a man's world, and that women in it are definitely underprivileged. Factually, much history can be created to sustain this, but the man's world is one of the troubles. It is not nearly as satisfactory a world as most folks think. And today, a number of rather brilliant people have come to the conclusion that one of the situations that is breaking down the American home is the increasing masculine inferiority complex. In the first place, the man's world, as we know it, has not been a great success. Let us face it, at this time. We're not sure that there is any direct answer to it. And we're quite sure that a competitive answer will not solve it. A general statement that it could be different if will not solve the situation either. But in the development of a patriarchal theory, we've had a very great weakness. And this weakness would also exist under a matriarchal system. In other words, a dominating power, either male or female, trying to make rules for the other, will always come to grief. It is a situation you can't avoid, for the simple reason that each one is assuming that the other thinks and feels as he does. Each one has a conviction that they understand the other. I've heard more men explain how thoroughly they understood their wives, and how many women who thoroughly understand their men's motives. They will give you a magnificent description of these motives. But the men's understanding of the woman is masculine, and the woman's understanding of the man is feminine. And the result is, when it comes right down to facts, nobody understands nothing. This waste of energy is further complicated by the fact that in this desperate understanding of others, the individual has forgot to examine himself and to find out just where he stands in this peculiar crisis that is so frequently with us. Actually, under a patriarchal system, you have a certain masculine gallantry. We won't mention the instances of the lack of this gallantry because they are also the subject for many hours' discussion. But there is a tendency to be gallant, particularly in modern civilization. This gallantry, however, is a very fumbling thing for the most part. It does not reach the facts. It does not result in a well thought out program. It results in emotional excesses of attitude that cure very little and may often complicate the situation worse than it was before. The woman's understanding of the man can lead to similar conclusions, and the resulting misunderstanding on both sides merely broadens the interval between the two groups, making a true understanding far more difficult to attain. It has always seemed to me that our unbalanced attitude in society is due very largely to the unbalanced attitude within the individual. Actually, the human being at this stage of his evolutionary development is psychologically androgynous. We know this is true. We know also that the only way in which either male or female can discover the opposite is within themselves. The only way in which the man can ever know woman is through the woman in himself. And the reverse is true of the woman. The only way she will ever know man is by the man in herself. And all outside relationships have as their basic purpose in nature the stimulation of these interior values. Through association, the individual gains a vicarious understanding, which is useless unless it is directed to its own final objective, and that is the unfoldment of the internal qualities, which through association can be brought to the surface. We have the same problem, for instance, in certain psychological testings and in certain psychological techniques. In these techniques, we attempt to release submerged values or submerged situations through symbolic stimulation of them. We try to use associationalism as a means of diagnosis and of therapy. Association means that the individual is caused to draw from himself certain conclusions or certain reactions or certain attitudes as the result of seeing these attitudes or coming into contact with these conditions outside of himself. It is a problem of the stimulation of attitudes through association, as the stimulation of the parental attitude through the actual establishment of the family. Thus, nature apparently desired most of all for us to realize that the final answer of all division is the internal experience of unity on that level. For example, in the spiritual life of man, the discovery of his true religious value lies not merely in his membership in an organization, but in the experience of religion within himself. The experience of friendship must arise within himself, of love, of devotion, dedication. All these experiences are felt within the individual. And actually, each individual has to experience his own totality in order to overcome all conflict which may arise on the outside. All exterior conflict represents the inadequacy of interior compatibility. The parts of the person have not been reconciled. Therefore, symbolically, he continues this division into his outer life. And it must continue until he discovers these values in his own nature. Instead of attempting to discover these values, he continues to press substitution upon these values or attempts to transfer his difficulty to the objective symbol of his own submerged pole. Therefore, he blames the woman for the weakness of the womanness in himself. And the woman, in turn, blames the man for the weakness of the manness within herself. Here you have your anima animus problem. But instead of trying to work with it directly, the tendency has been to assume that if we can achieve a correction in outer society, this will bring about the correction within the individual. We have been following this theory for hundreds, yes, thousands of years, with a magnificent record of having corrected nothing. Therefore, the continuance of this process cannot be assumed to be entirely successful. In the problem, therefore, that we face, we have no longer the primitive, extraordinary polarization, which was apparently required by nature when reproduction was the sole purpose, practically, of the polarization of a species. At that time, we had almost no mental overlife. We had very little, if any, profound emotional reflex. Life was, as in primitive society, an exceedingly simple, non-stimulating situation in which nearly everything was taken for granted and very little required consideration, contemplation, or inspired thoughtfulness. The individual had not attained the degree of development in which things that happened to him caused him to think. Rather, they simply caused him to accept, or if he could not accept, to reject and perish. There was no higher criterion than the immediate emergency. Today this is very largely changed, and the general trend of society should indicate rather clearly the direction in which we're supposed to go. But we still battle this directive with nearly every bit of force that we have, and as a result come into some pretty neurotic and pretty desperate situations. Let us assume then that the average individual placed in life as we know it, moving into life as we recognize it, has two levels upon which to function. One is instinct. This level, if unconditioned, is essentially honest. But unfortunately, instinct is psychologically conditioned. It is conditioned by heredity to some measure, but it is much more conditioned by environment. And the continual environment of the child, from its first awareness, has a tendency to deform its instincts, and to cause these instincts to become adapted to prevailing social processes. As the result of that, the child begins to develop most of the difficulties which we see in the more early types of society surrounding various artificial rules and taboos that were set up by primitive man. These have survived, rather refined and appearing much more elegant, but still essentially the same in principle. The child, therefore, growing into maturity, has already been educated on the grounds of the irreconcilability of certain basic values in life. His parents have always squabbled. His relatives have not gotten along. He is watching around him homes and families collapsing, and he finally takes it for granted that this is normal, regrettable, but inevitable, and that it is due to a tremendous mystery. This mystery being the fact that there are two sexes in the world that simply cannot understand each other and simply cannot get along. This not being able to understand each other is a mutual assumption of mystery. And mystery is, of course, without question, the most difficult thing in the world to live with. Mystery is the inscrutability of something. For probably 100 years after the general opening of Asia, we had a very difficult situation arise in Western relationships to countries like Japan, China, and India. These countries were mysteries. When we thought of India, we thought of the rope trick and a snake charmer. It never occurred to us that here was a great land filled with people very much like ourselves. These people got hungry just the way we do. They loved their children just the way we do. They tried to make a living, some succeeding and others failing, just as we do. Some of them got rich, some of them did not get rich. Some of them became leaders, others were destined to be followers, and life was much like our own. For 25 or 30 years, on my early memory, China was regarded as a glorified empire of Dr. Fu Manchu. All Chinese were inscrutable. They were strange and mysterious people, and of course anyone who keeps his mouth shut is a mystery from beginning to end. As Albert Hubbard pointed out, the way to correct that mystery is for him to speak, and then he is no longer mysterious to anybody. We had the same idea that Japan was very largely a land of incense burners and things of that nature, and we built concepts. These concepts have already pitched us into war. They have become very desperate concepts because we were willing to assume mystery. We built upon differences. We took it for granted that other people had very strange ways of arriving at conclusions, that their conclusions were strangely inconsistent, and that only among our own kind and under a civilization similar to ours could mystery be dissipated. Well, if there's been a mystery between East and West, it is simply nothing in comparison to the mystery between male and female. And the greatest mystery of all is the simple fact that there isn't any mystery, and that is something that no one seems to be able to face. Many people, of course, feel that if there isn't any mystery, there's nothing left to live for. But if what we call living now is the reward for mystery, I think we could get along without the mystery. What is necessary is the realization, gradually dawning upon good folks in all parts of the world, that there is actually no mystery except ignorance. And that ignorance is something that some folks carefully preserve. That they believe in certain things that ignorance is a blessing. Now, I know on religious levels a parallel to this. And that is that there are a great many persons who, when it is pointed out that in town there is another clergyman who is a little more brilliant and wonderful than their own, would never under any conditions go to hear him. As one person told me, they wouldn't go because they might like him. There has to be a certain dedication, even if it's only a dedication to stupidity. So lots of folks believe that a mystery of this nature is proper, right, and in a measure thrilling and endurable. But the penalties for it are so heavy that in this generation, with its more and more complicated ways of living, we are surrounded by too many mysteries, and the quicker we start solving some of them, the better. A good example of the problem of the negative effect of mystery upon man has been this threatened invasion from outer space, and the wonder as to what is happening behind the Iron Curtain, which is giving a great many people continuous jitters. Now, it seldom occurs to anyone that what is happening behind the Iron Curtain might not be mysterious at all. There might be a large number of rather hungry, dissatisfied people who wish they could do something about it. That the other side of the curtain is not another universe. It is only a group of individuals under a different series of problems. But these problems no more essentially mysterious than our own. And if we are afraid that they might move into our sphere of influence, they have been educated to fear that we might move into theirs, and that if we did, it would be the end for them. So where we do not understand, where we do not have certain common sharing, where we permit mystery to endure, we endanger health, mental, emotional, and physical. The actual problem of mystery in relationship to the conflict of the sexes is simply an inability to cope with two predominant factors. These predominant factors are not as real or as inevitable as we have come to think. They have, however, a certain legitimate foundation that we must do something about. Nature, in its peculiar and wonderful workings, has decreed that there are two forces operating in life. These two forces are not strictly divisible into sexual demarcation, but there is a heavy preponderance of these two forces in the situation we are considering. Man moves from two fundamental premises. One of these is emotional pressure, and the other is mental pressure. Now, in the case under which we are concerned, or with which we are concerned, we know that nature has so divided the allotment of human good that by sexual differentiation, the male sex is inclined to take an intellectual attitude toward existence, whereas the feminine sex is inclined to take an emotional attitude toward existence. So now comes the question, which is the greatest among us? And the answer is that there is no comparison. The very effort to create out of this a difference is to try to divide yourself, because every human being has mental and emotional content. The conflict between these two in his personal life is disastrous. Why should it be less disastrous in society? The person whose mental and emotional lives are not united within his own nature on a compatible level will never succeed in the major undertakings of life, and will be impelled to a despotism or to an anarchy of existence which will be unfortunate to all concerned. The human being lives with his own thoughts and emotions. He does not find anything very mysterious in the fact that he has a thought. It may be a rare occasion, but it is not a mystery. If it is a great thought and a stranger to him, it might be overwhelming, but he takes it in stride. In fact, he rather likes to suspect that there are more thoughts where that one came from. There is no greater mystery in all the world than how thought exists, but it isn't very mysterious to us because we become accustomed to it. Therefore, we take it for granted, although we cannot define it. Now, the average person, the average man, has a thought. A little later in the afternoon, he has a desire. He has an emotion. Perhaps his emotion is to him a purely masculine emotion. He is sitting in front of a television very much upset because his baseball team is losing. But the agony of this situation, the horrible emotional disaster when his favorite batter strikes out, is just as surely emotional as his previous thought was mental. Now, he does not go out and go into despondency because he has had both a mental and an emotional experience within a few moments of each other. He may try to rationalize one or the other. He may feel that altogether they constitute himself. Having been rather mentally preoccupied and emotionally disturbed, he goes out back into his craft shop, proceeds to use his hands and become physically active to sort of quiet himself down. Well, here is a complete history of the human race, manifesting in 3 actions. There is nothing mysterious in these actions. There is nothing about them other than the fact that not one of them can be explained in substance, only by its manifestations. Yet that phase of the mystery never did disturb him. The thing that might disturb him is if his emotions become inconsistent with his mental platform, or his mind leads him into activities which he considers emotionally reprehensible. Then he will have conflict. But why is this conflict? Simply because, as a being, he is not in control of both his mind and emotions, nor of his actions, perhaps. But here within one body, the great polarities of life are continually manifesting. And the individual, in one way or another, usually succeeds in holding himself together under this conflict. Precisely the same thing happens in the life of woman. Perhaps emotionally, she leans a little more than man does upon imagination. Imagination, of course, is a weaver of mysteries. And imagination requires for its constructive expression a basic optimism, a basic sense of the rightness of things. Emotions and imaginations arising from interior security will nearly always be constructive and optimistic, basically. And even the most fearsome emotional reflexes will rapidly subside after a crisis has passed, if beneath the emotional tumult there is a strong sense of security. Therefore, the emotional problem is one essentially of not having some fixed point of consciousness which is capable of passing censorship over an unreasonable emotion. Now, the woman who has a strong imaginative and emotional content may turn almost instantly to her intellectual prerogatives. The Greeks, by the way, found it convenient to personify wisdom by a woman rather than by a man. Minerva, or Pallas Athena, the goddess of the mind, was feminine. Perhaps this was not by any means an accident, but it certainly indicated that to Greek thinking, and it was one of the golden ages of careful thought and rationalization, there was nothing essentially and exclusively masculine about mentation. It was simply a process occurring and arising in the composite life of man. The woman, therefore, moves smoothly and easily from an emotional position to a mental position. It may not be quite as natural to her instincts, but it is nevertheless quite available. And under that, she becomes the provident ruler of a house. She maintains her family, and very often becomes a very important steadying influence upon the entire economy of the family, which is generally assumed to be a more or less masculine role. If by some circumstance she is no longer able to depend upon a masculine role in her family, she can assume leadership over it, raise her children, support herself, and fulfill practically every role that is normally associated with man. The only difference is that psychologically we do not find her quite as happy under this situation. She is not really happy trying to be a man. And a man is not truly happy trying to be a woman. And anyone who succeeds in this alternation of roles is not very happy and makes very few other people happy. Therefore, there is a distinction which nature has intended. But this distinction is not one of superiority or inferiority. It is a matter of emphasis. A matter of emphasis intended to create a more harmonious and balanced total life for the individual. This emphasis was created to supply him with a normal life, while his own consciousness and nature had not yet internally developed sufficiently to provide him with the necessary incentives to this equilibrium within himself. Consequently, if we assume that the two roles consist in each case of a dominant and a subdominant, the masculine role being mentally dominant and emotionally subdominant, the woman's role being emotionally dominant and mentally subdominant. This means that in both cases, an equilibrium is being sought. An equilibrium is being cultivated. And the motion of society has been continuously in this direction. If we begin to accept these things as brilliant examples of universal planning and begin to work with them and attempt at least mentally or emotionally, as the case may be, to comprehend them, we find in the resulting situation a great deal better basic relationship. A relationship which is no longer competitive. The competitive situation is really worse between man and man, or woman and woman, than it is between the two. Actually, man must compete mentally with man for the maintenance of his economic status in our way of life. To the same degree, woman must apparently compete with woman for the maintenance of her emotional status. And as you study particular case histories relating to this, you find that this is essentially the major conflict. In each case, the conflict is not with the opposing group. The conflict is with other members of the same group. The reason for this is obvious. Things which are similar can be measured in relationship to each other. And in this way, superiority or inferiority of one quality can be easily noted. Things that are not similar cannot be measured in terms of each other. Therefore, an immediate contrast or conflict is not possible. Here is one of the situations that nature has magnificently provided. And we see this as we estimate an art gallery with a large number of beautiful pictures. One of these pictures is a handsome portrait. And the next one is a beautiful still life, flowers in a vase, or some lovely garden scene. When the judges come to judge these paintings, it is almost certain that awards will be set for both groups. You're dealing with a different expression. The master of still life is just as great an artist as the master of portraiture. But you do not normally merely judge them in this way. You divide your awards into groups. A few years ago, I had to judge one of the local art exhibits in the city. And at that time, the great question among the panel of judges was to determine basically the groups. To determine first what examples belonged in certain classifications. Having classified them, it was then possible to judge similars. But it was not possible to simply say, this still life is better than this portrait, because you have no comparison that is adequate. Or else the comparison would have to be so blatant that the problem of judgment would be negligible. It is this problem in life also. This judging situation, this passing of judgment on things which are not similar and which cannot be understood by individuals who have only one approach. Now, in judging a group of art, for example, it would be very bad in an exhibit to select a panel of 5 judges, all who specialized in portraiture, and ask them to pick out the best picture in the show. They would certainly pick a portrait. There'd be no question about this. It's human nature. Not because they meant to be unfair, but because they could not help but favor that which was their own interest. Therefore, the need for a distribution of judging factors to give everybody a fair chance. In human life also, in judging people, we cannot judge from a single point of view. To judge the whole of a situation, we must judge with the whole of our own equipment. And if this equipment is too biased, we cannot judge. And in too many instances, our position is too biased to make fair judgment possible. And where this fails, we have an epidemic of blame. We have individuals forever criticizing each other. Criticism is sometimes nothing more or less than an expression of distaste for difference. The individual cannot find anything good in that which is different from himself. And on the basis of the peculiar rightness of himself, he passes adverse judgment on everything else. This is why we have felt for so long that our situation, this tremendous problem of moving humanity into a closer integration between its male and female contingencies, depends upon a specialized program in which we go behind the so-called biological factors, go deeper to recognize that only the individual who has certain good in his own nature can recognize it in anyone else, and that only persons with certain degrees of imagination can recognize the importance of imagination. Only individuals with certain degrees of intuition can be aware of the intuitive factors in the lives of others or the importance of those factors. So that unless we are given some basic education in the discovery of values and our ability to appreciate difference and to recognize indifference, that in the differences of things we have their dynamic, that this dynamic is not conflict, but that it is motion, that it is life, that it is significance. And as we cannot have a picture that is important without lights and shadows, without contrast, we must have these contrasts in our own lives to enrich living. And it is a pity that contrast created to enrich should impoverish. But the picture depends not only upon the light and shadow, it depends upon the law of draftsmanship possessed by the artist, who is capable of making light and shadow the servants and instruments of purpose. The lack of purpose in human relationships today is a reflection of the lack of purpose in individual existence today. The insecurity in the home represents merely a generalization of the insecurity of the individual. And the hope that security can be attained by dominance is a lost cause. We do not attain security, we create rebellion. The moment we create dominance, we bring underground parties into existence. The moment we have despotism, we have secret revolution and rebellion that will ultimately break out into visible and physical rebellion. The forcing of one situation upon another will never cure the basic pattern. It will result in endurance. It will result in a certain resigning to inevitables, a conscientious resignation into neurosis. It will not solve anything. What we have to have is a more dynamic creativity in our thinking. This creativity depends on one or two basic situations. The first is the personal acceptance of responsibility in connection with relationship situations. The moment a relationship situation arises, what causes it? The answer, of course, is the patent idea that things going wrong can be blamed on this problem of common misunderstanding between two sexes, two groups of people who just do not get along and never have, and the Bible said they weren't going to, and that's all there is to it. This kind of attitude is defeatism to start with. Actually, your situation arises from perhaps one of several causes. The first, and perhaps one of the most basic, is physical incompatibility. There's no use trying to escape this fact. We have it. But what is the cause of this? Is it merely the fact that two persons are so biologically or neurotically constructed that they cannot get along together? This, I would say, is possible but reasonably rare. It is by no means the common cause. The physical incompatibility mostly and most frequently arises from psychological tensions, by means of which the natural relationships of persons become impossible, or at least seriously damaged. The trouble rises in the thinking first. It arises in suspicion, in doubt, in frustration, and perhaps in a general sense of isolation. Isolation means outsideness in a situation. It rises from the situation of not being able to break through the curtain of mystery, or finding another individual who is unable to break through or be receptive to anyone else breaking through, and therefore two individuals under the same roof remain totally isolated. Perhaps the isolation does not begin that way. One of the most common problems we have is divergence of interests. These interests mean that one individual has no active participation in the life activities of the other person. That on the one hand, business takes too much time. On the other hand, there are too many hours for imagination, too many situations under which doubt can arise, and hardly enough faith to prevent doubt from arising. These kind of patterns are all psychological, but their reaction upon the physical life of the individual can be so great that the end result is physical incompatibility and inability to maintain domestic relations on a reasonable level. This means that most of our trouble lies in thoughtlessness, lies in the continuation of prejudice, lies in the false standard of masculinity and femininity which has developed through the years, has become part of our legal codes, has become part of our way of life. We mentioned last week the effect of the concept of age upon people, the concept that they must grow old, the concept that they must become infirm, and how this probably takes from 10 to 20 good years of life out of the human pattern, simply because we are assured that this is the way it must be. Our personal relationship problems come under the same hypnotic type of pressure. We are assured that we must expect certain things to be wrong, that we must also look forward to inequalities of relationship, accept them, endure them, bear them. After we go along for this situation for a time, and things do not work out well, we are likely to fall into an ocean of self-pity, which will certainly gain us nothing, but will finally result in continuing and increasing antagonism against the person whom we feel is responsible for the fact that we must express self-pity. In other words, we are the miserable victim of something. And if the marriage partner has not been everything that's desirable, that certainly is the first choice we have in determining blame. Actually, maybe both persons are sitting moping, trying to figure out what's wrong. This, in turn, helps nothing. There is nothing better to create a final disaster than both persons crawling into their own shells and deciding to sit it out, live it out, or die it out. With this pattern, we have almost certain trouble. Actually, most individuals start out in life with a degree of optimism. This degree of optimism has been subject to some rather unhappy situations, however. I have noticed that some families insist on taking this optimism out of their own children before it has had a chance to get anywhere. One of the common things is that an unhappy parent transfers upon a child and gradually proceeds to indoctrinate that child with all the faults of the other parent, indicating that the child must experience a rather miserable childhood, in contradistinction to the glowing reports that they may hear about the possibility of domestic felicity, and the experience is much more convincing than the reports. Another very bad situation is parental indoctrination of children with broad philosophies of life derived from neurosis. The parent who tells the child just what kind of unfortunate and miserable people they are likely to be and how despicable a prospective marriage partner is going to turn out is really causing a very unhappy situation. One a young woman, not one, by the way, I have probably had 50 of them in the course of time, but one quite recently, told me that she had been indoctrinated by her own mother in the philosophy that the successful marriage was to pay no attention to the man and take everything he had. Now, to indoctrinate children with this, and it's not too uncommon, is not exactly conducive of anything, any more than it is conducive of good for a group of men to get together and describe their difficulties and encourage some other young man starting out in life to expect nothing good from marriage. It can work both ways, and does. And it is an indoctrination that is essentially stupid. Yet with this indoctrination, the young person is able to discover abundant evidence to support the negative point. He can find so much proof against value that it never occurs to him that this negative proof is largely the result of individuals who are in the situation they are in because of what they are themselves. This is the thing that the young person does not learn to realize. He does not come to know that these complaining, unhappy people simply have not developed their own natures adequately, and that their complaint should not be against each other, but their complaint should be against their own code and what it has done to them. They have lived a wrong pattern, have been miserable under it, and have blamed someone else. This is only to be answered by certain test cases that have come up. In a number of our universities, groups of basic study of eugenical problems and also problems of human relationships on a practical level have been introduced. These young people have been taught from the beginning the essential values of living. And while the instruction was certainly not thoroughly adequate, it wasn't. It was very little better than a technical presentation of common sense, which, however, has great advantages. The fact is that in these institutions we have the records of results. And where such classes and courses are introduced and are used, the rate of divorce among the graduates is markedly lower. Indications show that where such courses are given in universities on college level, the rate of divorce is down as much as 50% below that of schools where no such instruction is given. This proves very simply that a little knowledge will help if it is the right basic kind of knowledge. Now, this kind of knowledge is not theoretically or actually psychological knowledge. It is not based upon Freudian psychology. It is based very largely upon practical approach and discussion. One of the things being emphasized is simply the truth and the effort to discover it and to build around a truthful approach to life. Recognition of personal defects. The realization that it is no more successful to go into human relationships without adequate knowledge than it is to enter business without adequate knowledge. An individual with no knowledge of a business scarcely can optimistically hope to make an immediate success. Yet young people with no knowledge of life optimistically assume that they can combine their ignorance to form something that will have enduring and permanent significance. This is not easy. Courses in human relationships should be compulsory. They should be given on a practical level that does not violate the idealism of anyone or attempt any creedal imposition upon the child's or young person's thinking. It should be a simple statement of the obvious fact that nature intended human relationships to succeed, and that with adequate knowledge and adequate understanding and acceptance, the majority of these relationships will succeed. That where they fail, someone has personally fallen below the level upon which success is possible. And in most instances, believe it or not, both parties have. Perhaps one fell first, and by demoralizing the other, caused the other person to begin to compromise their principles and lose their natural orientations. So the whole thing collapses like a house of cards. To escape this kind of collapse on a philosophical level, counseling will be of help. Counseling, however, implies something which should not be necessary. Certainly it is necessary after a situation is out of control. But the individual who may require counseling on involved situations should not be assumed to require counseling on situations that are reasonably obvious and about which he can gain sufficient insight to manage his own affairs with dignity. Counseling, therefore, should mean emergency help. It should not mean that it is necessary for a psychologist to guide every marriage through its first 25 years. This is not only very difficult on the patient, but disastrous on the psychologist, who has no time left to worry about his own problems. The need for practical thinking is so obvious that when these problems come along, we wonder why they get so complicated. We look back over society and we see some of the reasons. We realize the increasing complexity of life. We realize the increasing individuality of the individual and the divergences of interests which mark the modern way of life. These, however, are here to stay. We're not going to get away from them. Therefore, our relationships must grow to include them, and must grow to one thing which love always has a struggle with, and that is the kind of love which frees rather than enslaves. Most persons have some of their troubles because they do not love the other person as much as they love themselves. And being constantly desirous of being extremely and extraordinarily kind to themselves, they are not always able to extend this virtue to other people. Love, meaning only the satisfaction of our own desire, can lead very rapidly to domestic tragedy. True affection is that which invests another person with a kind of psychological and spiritual freedom. True love makes us want to help that other person to be themselves, and finds the greatest joy in the varieties and contrasts which this produces. Wherever the individual enslaves or controls, or interprets love merely as a means of satisfying his own desire for happiness, this shows ignorance. It shows lack of basic insight. And this degree of basic insight should not be lacking in a people that has had the opportunity and the privileges of advancement and education which we have enjoyed. It simply is a primitive hangover. It is something that we should have left behind long ago, but which still tenaciously hangs on as part of the prevailing attitude of selfishness which we all more or less suffer from. What is the answer to selfishness? Well, there are a number of answers. One answer, of course, is insight, the gradual development of a knowledge of the true values of things. Here, I believe, is another important factor. Most people, in every relationship in life, need, or seem to need, a measure of common support. We find that it is usually expedient that we be able to turn rather quickly in an emergency to something that seems to be strong enough to sustain us when our own strength fails. Usually we depend upon some structure of social providence for this strength. We turn upon an institution for it. We turn upon our physician for it, or our analyst. Or we turn upon custom, or some collective pattern, to provide a security that perhaps we are not quite certain we are able to sustain. In a course of years, for instance, we have done considerable work in connection with various services, among others, marriages. We have married a great many people, and it is observable that the ceremony of marriage does become one of these supports. It becomes a little pattern of importance, by means of which we seemingly gain a little moral confidence, and also a little deeper sense of responsibility. Individuals who choose a marriage with some form of religious sacrament are married with a better thought and look back upon the marriage ceremony with a little more sense of its importance in their lives than those, for example, who are simply married for the justice of the peace. The presence of something which solemnizes, which makes important a major step in life, is valuable. I do not mean by this the kind of marriage which costs the family its holdings and includes, as one marriage that I know about, $10,000 set aside for a jazz orchestra. This is not what we mean. We do not mean the extravagant marriage, but we mean the marriage in which there is some moral pressure created or incited by the solemnity and seriousness of an occasion. This seems to constitute something in the subconscious mind which gives a little more strength. The remembrance of solemn obligations solemnly taken makes the person want to try harder for some reason. Some way he doesn't want to fail a deep and serious obligation that he has assumed. Therefore, the importance of religion in the home is perhaps keyed to this first experience. It is keyed to the presence of this security, this sense of something that can be leaned upon in emergency, the presence of a power of spiritual value, a value which invites the individual to cultivate those graces which he assumes are of divine will and purpose. If he believes that moral life, spiritual life, depends to a degree upon self-control, upon moderation, upon kindliness, the forgiveness of our enemy, the reconciliation of these doubts and uncertainties with which we are afflicted, and the presence of a spiritual value, not only in himself but in the other person, and not only in both of them but in the union of them as one spiritual entity in life. This framework has done much to protect the home through the centuries. The loss of this framework by modern man is almost certainly the reason why psychology has become so important in these relationships. It becomes the substitute framework. It becomes a new reason for trying to solve things. But unfortunately, your psychological conditioning usually comes in after damage has been done, whereas your spiritual value begins with the beginning of the marriage and is not dependent upon a pressing need at the moment at which it is given. I would therefore feel that the general drift towards materialism is very difficult for the marriage relationship and does not contribute to the mutual understanding of human beings. It does not prevent the situation or contribute to preventive therapy. Your preventive therapy must arise from early conditioning, and the probabilities of a successful home are measured before the home is ever established. And on that original measurement, we have to work. Here are things that we find in working on these problems. The tendency today to spoil children is almost a certain foundation for later family trouble. The child who has not been given the experience of self-control, who has not been required to use wisely whatever privileges or opportunities have been offered, who has not been taught the value of orderly economy, who has come to regard life merely as a playground in which he can do exactly as he pleases, whether it be the boy or the girl. If they have this conditioning, they are bad material for permanent, mature relationships. When such young people as that finally get together, they find no basic inclination to interpret affection as unselfishness. Lacking this instinct, they will pervert a home almost before it's established. We had one young couple not long ago that were married on a Thursday and were separated on a Saturday of the same week. The first time either one of them was confronted with even a sense of responsibility, that there might be some question of the continuance of total personal freedom, they collapsed. There was no concept of teamwork, no concept of the privilege or pleasure of bringing happiness to someone else. Even under such conditions, even the strongest biological ties would be totally insufficient, because the situation had already moved onto a psychological level. The lack, therefore, of a gradual insight into mature associations between persons cannot work well in these times. I do not think it is true that the situations of the modern home are in themselves impossible. I do not think that even the atomic bomb and the world situation around us makes it inevitable that the majority of homes should fail. Nor does it make it inevitable that a large percentage, even in the minority bracket, should fail. It seems rather that these heavy pressures are by nature and by substance a tremendous challenge for the restoration of value through the home. The individual who loses faith in the general broad structure of society becomes ever more desperately in need of a measure of compatibility and understanding in his own small personal world. He will be able to face larger emergencies better if he has some securities from which to operate. And he will also be able to survive the tremendous psychological pressure of the world around him if he has greater securities in a small pattern of mutual values which are important. The average person today has no valued incentives. He lacks a just reason for his own existence. The great reason that has been given to us through time for survival has always been the establishment of family and the protection of the young. This has always been one of our great values. A value which has led to some of the most noble and magnificent actions that have ever been performed by human beings. Actions which are seldom gloriously advertised, but have much to do with making noble people and enriching that phase of consciousness which we must take with us when we have departed from this particular vale of circumstances. The growth of the human soul is far more rapidly advanced in the acceptance of home and family than in any effort to evade it or avoid it in the quest for spiritual sufficiency. The individual who thinks he can become truly good by escaping or avoiding temptations and problems fails. The great achievement is victory in personal relationships and the gradual impersonalization of these relationships through mutual understanding, and the gradual elevation of great values which are beyond person, but which can never be discovered except through person. It would naturally seem, then, that our greatest defense against the challenge of the atomic age, the uncertainty, the danger that threatens practically all of the civilized and probably the uncivilized world, that this great overwhelming insecurity would and should naturally lead to a greater determination to set up symbolic securities where these can possibly be achieved. The failure to do this must therefore be regarded as symptom of a false situation, one in which the natural instincts of the person are not being given a fair opportunity. Religion has played a double role in this entire dilemma. Spiritually, as religion, as a principle of value, it has played a positive role and has probably been the most elevating force in the development of man's concept of marriage. Sectarian theology, however, has not been quite so helpful and has generally been represented by situations which have set up false values and have interpreted religion in a way detrimental to the establishment of normal human life relationships. I might mention something, namely that sectarian religious schools are not particularly fortunate for young people. I have found graduating from these schools some of the most unadjusted human beings that I have ever met. Unadjusted, first of all, because they were brought up within an atmosphere which was not sustained by society after they left the school. They entered as babes into the woods, or lambs to the slaughter, when they left the protection of the school. They lived in a more or less cloistered atmosphere, surrounded by strong spiritual or theological overtones. These overtones came to be rather dominant. And with these overtones were instilled a great number of sectarian prejudices, which also did not help. I know one case of a young man who was brought up in such a cloistered atmosphere. He was devout, he was dedicated, and he was just the kind of a son that most doting mothers would have loved to have. He was really a noble example of consecrated ignorance. This situation was not successful, however, because only a short time after he left this particular cloistered atmosphere, he went to work for a large corporation and 3.5 months later committed suicide. He couldn't stand the adjustment. It was too impossible a situation. He suddenly came into a world for which he was totally unfitted. This is the religious angle carried too far and inclined to undermine the normal, proper attitudes of persons. There is a beautiful thought associated with innocence, but innocence in this world is dangerous. It must be gradually transformed into its positive polarity, which is virtue. Virtue is always commendable. Innocence may only be a charming form of ignorance. Virtue is the individual who has experienced difficulties, who has known good and bad, and has chosen the good. Whereas innocence is the individual who may know nothing of either. This is not even a protective force. We do not serve people by protecting them from living. We serve them by trying to help them to experience through living to integration of their own lives. So the problem of immaturity naturally is a very important one in connection with home building, which usually occurs in the years of life in which practical experience is not too abundant. For this purpose, it is essential, wherever possible, that a young marriage be given a fair chance, that the oldsters should not exercise too powerful an influence upon it, that the young people should not be forced into situations which they do not understand, but that every reasonable means should be used to see that they are well informed, that they understand the responsibilities they are assuming, and as far as is possible under the condition, that they are equipped for a better understanding as it comes along. Another group of sadly underprivileged folks are only children. These children who have not grown up with a sufficient sense of sharing can come into many troubles later. The child who grows up alone in the presence of adults, or who does not have the need for teamwork emphasized early in life, may never develop it at all. I have noticed that the tragedy rate is quite high among children where there has not been a fairly large family, or where one child has been spoiled. The spoiled child is a detriment to all concerned. Another difficulty that frequently arises is where the children, or particularly the child, has been brought up in an environmental situation in which there has not been reasonable regulation and control of activity. A great deal of thought has to be devoted. The child must be given useful, purposeful, meaningful activities. The child who never learns to do anything but play is a bad risk. And that children must play and should play is vital and important to their lives. But that play should always include usefulness in some part or measure. That something should always occur in connection with their living, by which they realize that it's not only necessary and proper to enjoy, but that it is also necessary to take a share in the seriousness of living. The young families that set up family council with their children, who appoint small tasks to children, will develop better family people than those who insist on doing everything and letting the child do nothing. In education also, we come on a lot of troubles. In the educational program, there is a great deal to be analyzed as to the educational potential of the child. If the child has not a natural aptitude, the effort to force education beyond the capacity of the child will also create trouble. It creates false standards of value, and it delays the establishment of the life upon its proper level. There are some young people by whose natures the establishment of a home at 26, 28, or 30 is naturally indicated. There are others by whose compound nature the establishment of a home at 21, 22, or 23 is far more desirable. It is desirable for the individual to move without artificial distortion of his natural instincts as far as possible. And the idea that these natural instincts have to be wrong should not be the main consideration. If these instincts move from a well-integrated sense of value, if the child has been taught basic responsibility and basic integrity, his values will normally move in a manner conforming with his aptitudes, and they break between what the individual can do and what he is forced to do, will also set up a neurosis and destroy his entire integrity. Thus, many things lead us to the final point of the essential conflict as we know it in the grown-up person. Remember, everything that we say, we transform a thought into words. The words go out of our mouths and go right around and go into our ears again, creating one of the tightest little vicious circles that you can possibly imagine. The individual who cannot be converted by his own thoughts can be converted by his own words, because his words come to him almost as though someone else had spoken. And you've heard of people who talk themselves into things and out of things. Well, it's very true. Consequently, any policy in life by which we adapt a pat attitude and then proceed to sell it to ourselves year after year will ultimately sell us the thing we are stating, whether we originally believed it or not. It will also sell it to us hypnotically, so that we will lose all perspective as to the facts of the matter. Therefore, the idea of selling ourselves continuously with a negative emphasis upon human relationships will accomplish little or no good. The problem as to who was wrong first, and whether it was Adam and Eve or somebody else. This ancient concept that with Adam's fall we sinned us all is of no good value anymore. The idea also that we must complain, that we must assume that by virtue of our manhood we will be forced to protect a situation that perhaps we do not like, or because of our womanhood we shall have to endure manhood. These patterns, the more we talk about them, the more we reinforce them, the more sorry we become for ourselves over them, and the more it looks as though heaven and earth had biologically conspired for our misery. The more we sell ourselves this, the more certainly we will destroy our lives. Many times a difficult situation descends into a complete pattern of negative nagging, of complete condemnation of other people. Now, it may be that under occasions we get pretty bad deals. There's no one that can doubt this question. There's no reason to say that sometimes both men and women are apparently the victims of incredible misfortunes and difficulties. That they are the victims of the outrageous conduct of others, particularly of their marriage partners. When this situation arises, however, and it can arise, in spite of the best efforts to prevent it. But if the best efforts are used, it'll be more rare than it is, that we know. But where it does arise anyway, the solution to the matter must be, for all good concerned, as nearly intelligent and as nearly reasonable as the situation can possibly permit. Every effort must be used not to permit the psychic consequences to become an obsession. And they can become an obsession, causing the individual who feels himself or herself to be wronged to turn around upon society and try to work it out by wronging someone else. An attitude of revenge, or a total attitude of vengeance against the entire sex represented by the individual with whom they have had difficulty. This is not nearly as detrimental to the adversary as it is to the individual who permits the attitude to exist in himself. All revenge attitudes ultimately destroy the person who holds them. And in many instances, the object never even finds out about it. The tremendous disaster is the result of permitting the generalization of a particular, a bad semantic procedure. The idea that all dogs are like the dog that bit us is wrong and is the basis of tremendous misery. I have been party to a great many cases in which these things have been unfolded, and where an individual, having had one unhappy experience in life, has created from that a brittle and difficult defense mechanism, which has resulted in 3 or 4 bad marriages, one right after the other. The individual was so locked in their own position, so loaded with hatred and disillusionment and hurt, that it would never be possible for them to find anyone with whom they could be happy. And of course this attitude did act as a contagious factor. It destroyed the interest of the other person. It destroyed their willingness to try. Because where anyone is against a situation that is obviously unfair and completely locked, they cannot function to assist to bring a situation of this kind into a better relationship. So the situation only continued to defend the original premise that everything must always be wrong. If these attitudes can relax a little, with this relaxation will end much of the conflict between human beings. A conflict which is really fired largely by traditional factors, by individuals not having fair, basic values, not really trying themselves, and in this way not only acting badly, but discouraging others who might try. We gain far more in life by taking constructive attitudes. And a constructive attitude does not mean a blind one. A constructive attitude does not mean that we do not see the faults in others. Perhaps the constructive attitudes means that we can see faults both in others and in ourselves. And in this common recognition of common imperfection, we have a bond of sympathy upon which to operate. Certainly, the creation of sympathies, basic sympathies of understanding, and a sincere desire to explore the wealth of consciousness in each other, and to benefit from that, and to share these values. These can become very positive, constructive forces. We must have some of this constructiveness and recognize that we are dealing with a complementary situation and not a conflicting one. That we are in the presence of many needs exemplified through a basic pattern. Every life must have contrast in order to survive. We have sleeping and waking. In the world we have day and night. In all things we have motion. And this motion brings with it magnificent beauty in all of these movements, if we are able to accept these things as beautiful rather than as difficult. There is no mystery here. There is simply man's willingness to be sensitive to things, willingness to forget the idea that difference is the basis of antagonism, and realize that difference handled intelligently is the basis of the greatest sympathies, the greatest growth, the greatest mutual benefit and betterment. We would not be a good world if we all thought alike, all lived exactly alike, all believed exactly alike. We think it would be the golden age, but it would not be. The real beauty of life lies in constructive contrasts, constructively accepted, and the individual who lives each day to discover something new that is good. If we could approach family and children and all the different personalities this way, we would find, as those who do approach it in this manner have found, and there are very good examples of success in these fields, that this is a enriching situation. I talked to a man only a few days ago that said that his children, he had several, were the most expensive luxuries in his life, but that no matter what they cost, or how much he had to struggle for them to provide them with everything that they needed, that mere association with them and the watching of the unfolding of their lives was a treasure and a blessing which was beyond calculation. That nothing could substitute for the beauty of watching life grow. Now, this is a good attitude. Our mothers have said the same thing. Unfortunately, the same mothers and fathers do not always say the same thing. It is therefore necessary to get a little more understanding in this, and by means of deepening our reason for life, so that it includes growth rather than merely satisfaction, or brings us our greatest satisfaction through growth. By such standards, there is no longer any war or any conflict. All opposites are reconciled in the beauty of great art, and the greatest of all arts is the art of life. Well, the time is up.